I know what you're probably thinking. Why weren't Sentinels or 100 Thieves at Masters? How come I couldn't root for Tenz and Asuna in Tokyo? Well, franchising is tough. The top tier of Valorant talent has been condensed onto just 30 teams in 3 leagues, and with only 12 spots in Tokyo, there were a lot of strong teams that just couldn't make the cut. Disclaimer, I will talk about some teams more than others. This is because certain teams are simply not as cool. If you think I didn't talk about your favorite team enough, please feel free to take that as a personal attack towards you for liking them. KRÜ had long dominated the Latin American scene throughout 2021. With their star duelist Kesnet, aka the Next Simple, along with Mizzino, Klaus, Nags, and Delzik, they managed to win massive upsets over Sentinels and Fnatic before falling to Gambit in the semis at Champs. Map 3 was filled with insane plays from both teams, and despite being the loser, there was massive hope that this squad was the next big thing in Valorant. But just 4 days later, their head coach owner announced that he was a free agent. He was still willing to sign back with KRÜ, but he wanted to test the open market. In the end, he chose to sign with Leviatán. After acquiring the old Australs core of King, Takolia, Melzer, and Adverso, along with the late season addition of Shy, they managed to beat out KRÜ for a spot at Masters Copenhagen. KRÜ still managed to qualify, but they had to beat NIP at the LATAM Brazil Last Chance qualifier to get there, something Leviatán had failed to do to get to Reykjavik. KRÜ may have made it to the event, but they didn't make it out of groups. However, by winning that LCQ, they gave Leviatán a free ride to playoffs, where they beat XSET and got a top 6 finish. At Champions, KRÜ once again failed to make it out of groups after having to play FPX, the reigning champions, twice. Leviatán had a similarly difficult group, facing the LCQ phenoms Team Liquid. They managed to beat Liquid, but next up were the runner-ups from Copenhagen, PaperX. Thanks to the second place curse, a curse placed on whichever team was the runner-up of the previous event, Leviatán managed to get the upset, and another spot in playoffs. They were quickly sent to the lower bracket by Loud, the eventual champions, before being eliminated by FPX. After Champions, the two teams swapped around a few of their players. KRÜ dropped Kesnet, Delzik, and Mizzino, while Leviatán let go of Melzer and Adverso. KRÜ then decided to pick up Melzer along with Zand from NIP, as well as Davies and Ixeti. Leviatán signed Noswer from Furia, then got Mizzino and Kesnet, reuniting them with owner. At lock-in, Leviatán struggled to fit Kesnet into their roster, so they released him soon after. KRÜ wasn't exactly liking what they were getting from Zand for some reason, so they brought back Kesnet instead. Despite KRÜ being eliminated in the first round of lock-in, and Leviatán making it to the top 8, they were both eliminated by Na'Vi. Idiots like myself hear that and think, these teams are maybe not equal, but they're not that far apart from each other. Oh boy, were my fellow idiots and I wrong. Leviatán had a wobbly but decent split. They managed to beat NRG early on, but ended up facing a lot of teams when they were at their best, losing to Furia, 100 Thieves, and EG before having to finish their season against Cloud9 and Loud. They managed to sneak into the playoffs, but went 0-2 and were eliminated. KRÜ, on the other hand, never really had any hope to begin with. They, along with Detonation and Pacific, were the first teams to go 0-9 in Valorant franchising. While Detonation probably deserved this title, KRÜ certainly didn't. They had close matches against a ton of very good teams. They just couldn't get any of them over the line. It's tough living in the shadows of Loud, the only Brazilian team that's proven themselves capable on the international stage. Brazil has long struggled as a region with tons of great players, but not many good teams. Other than Loud, the talent was spread too thin. Furia, despite never attending a Masters LAN, managed to win both South American Last Chance qualifiers. Also, they're kinda like the Liquid of Brazil, except for the fact that they got eliminated immediately from Champions both times. But after replacing Noswer with Brazilian favorite MW0, they had the potential to be Brazil's next super team. MIBR was sort of a mishmash between their old roster, bringing over FRZ and JZZ, and the old Keyed Stars roster, with Heat, Muriz, and RGL Meister. MIBR never really did much in Valorant. They were too busy trying to make it in North America under the name Immortals. But Keyed had impressed a lot of people, especially Heat, who was by far their best player on the team. MIBR had also gotten Bazooka, Loud's head coach, who had led them to their Champions victory last year. It seems like Brazil was finally concentrating their insane talent onto the right teams. Both teams kinda flopped at lock-in, but Furia got beat by Fnatic, the eventual winners, and MIBR got beat by Talon, who were very impressive at lock-in as well. Just ignore how the regular season went for them. Furia started off the regular season pretty great, going 4-2 with their only losses being to Loud and Cloud9, the clear-cut top 2 of the split. Furia certainly seemed like the clear-cut third. MIBR also started off strong, managing a huge upset over NRG, but internal conflicts began to unravel MIBR. Heat, the star duelist, wanted the team to play more loose so he could shine more as an individual. Bazooka wanted the team to play more structured. What followed was a 10-map loss streak that eliminated them from playoffs and wouldn't end until Heat was benched and their analyst Chosen took his place. We'll talk about how that streak ended later. Furia finished out the season losing to all 3 NA teams that they faced. They still made playoffs, but only pulled off a win against Leviatán. Loud and NRG knocked them out of playoffs to end their season. Both Brazilian teams were way more impressive than many previous ones, but they still have a ways to go. Sentinels is a household name in Valorant. They start off with a roster of some talented former Counter-Strike players in Shazam, Sick, and Dapper, then mixed them with 2 Overwatch players, Zoms and Sinatra, who was the reigning Overwatch MVP. The Counter-Strike purists of early Valorant looked down on teams like Sentinels and FaZe, who picked up Overwatch refugees instead of CS refugees, and those purists were certainly clutching at their pearls when Sentinels went on to become the best team of 2020. They did struggle at first strike, partially because Shazam's father had passed away during their preparation. I've never even lost a grandparent. I cannot imagine grieving your father while preparing for the biggest tournament of your life. They were eliminated in the semifinals, but it was a solid run considering the circumstances. When the 2021 season began, Sentinels returned right to their winning ways. Then it was revealed that Sinatra allegedly did some very bad things and was suspended by the team. So they decided to replace him with arguably the greatest player in the game at the time, Tenz. He didn't slot into Sinatra's role perfectly, but he was so good that it didn't really matter. They steamrolled through to win Masters 1, then didn't drop a map in Reykjavik, Valorant's first international tournament. The team was on top of the world, ready to continue their dominance in Berlin. But a lot of very weird things were about to happen. First, Bren Esports, a team from the Philippines, couldn't make it to Berlin. They were in Sentinels group, so Sentinels would have to play a round-robin group stage rather than double elimination. Sentinels had also started beefing with G2, another popular org from Europe. When they met on the server, Sentinels backed up their trash talk and won. But when they faced each other a second time, they weren't as fortunate. Both teams qualified for playoffs, but G2 ended up with a higher seed. This allowed Sentinels to get matched up against Envy in the first round. Envy had grown pretty tired of losing to Sentinels, so they decided to pick up Ye, who was quickly starting to challenge Tenz as the best player in NA. Sentinels were eliminated, but already had a spot in Champs, which was the real goal for everyone on the team. Or at least that's what they said. When it came time to walk the walk, Sentinels stumbled. They lost incredibly close games against Liquid and KRÜ, getting eliminated in groups. What followed was a disastrous 2022, where Envy, now Optic, dominated the NA scene, and Sentinels continued falling off further and further and further. They tried to replace Zoms with Kempeki, but they still finished the second split completely winless. It was at this point that Sentinels had to do something drastic. They had lucked their way into LCQ thanks to Ghost collapsing in Split 2 playoffs. In preparation, they swapped out Sick for Zalsis, then swapped out Kempeki for Shroud. It was the ultimate clout play to bring about the end of this clout team. They managed to make a little bit of noise, but fell to 100 Thieves in lower bracket. They did bring a ton of attention to their matches, but you can't keep up the clout chasing forever. Eventually you have to build a solid team and start getting better results. So, after making it into the franchise league, Sentinels did just that. They scrapped everyone from the previous roster that made them a household name despite some alleged promises. Then they signed Zekken, one of the most wholesome and talented young players in the game. To help him get integrated, they brought along his IGL, Def, and his coach, Psycho. They kept on Tenz, the only wholesome player from their former roster, then brought on Sasi and Pankata, 2 world champions who, while not exactly known for being wholesome, were still very mild players publicly. It was a major shift from the team. They had gone from 5 bold and brash trash talkers to 5 normal, kind dudes. Perhaps they had learned from their mistakes in 2022, and were finally going to build a true contender. But those hopes were too good to be true. Within weeks of finally getting together as a team, they played in the Tarek Ludwig Invitational. They were clearly not prepared for their matches and finished in 3rd. Then they got first rounded by Fnatic at lock-in. They started off the regular season with an exhilarating win over 100 Thieves, but after losing their next 2 matches, they fired Psycho. Why? I don't really know. But in their next match, Tenz was on their bench, with Marv, Optic's former star controller and Masters 2 MVP, taking his place. Small aside real quick, but back when Marv was on FaZe and Tenz was on Cloud9, Marv said some not so good things about Tenz and his girlfriend Kaide. Marv didn't know his comments were live streamed and immediately apologized for them. There wasn't much animosity between the two afterwards, but if you fast forward to now, Tenz had been struggling both in performance and potentially mentally. Kaide had been diagnosed with cancer before lock-in and hadn't told Tenz until afterwards. This break was probably very important for Tenz and his well-being, and it wouldn't have been possible without Marv. A perfect way to make up for that old mistake. Either way, Marv was not the magical fix that this team needed. They just could not find their identity. So after another humiliating loss to Evil Geniuses, they decided to drop Def and bring back Tenz for the final 2 games, both of which they managed to win. They stayed in the playoff race for a few more hours, but once NRG beat EG, they were eliminated. Now their only hope for 2023 is in LCQ. Luckily, they are finally finished with the roster moves. They have 4 tournament winners on this team, with Second, their only untitled player, actually being their best. You could say I'm just pandering to the largest fanbase in Valorant, but I truly think this team has a very good shot at making it to champs, so long as Rob Moore doesn't try to mess with anything else. As a fan of this particular team from the very beginning, I have a lot of things to say. 10,000 words just on their first 2 years, in fact. But that is for another time. For now, I'll briefly talk about this 100 Thieves. When DDK, Sean Gares, and Mike's HD were brought onto this team, everything finally started to make sense. No more confusion over roles. No more failure to adapt to the meta in time. No more BS. Just good, honest Valorant, played by some insanely talented players. Asuna, the team's longest tenured player, could finally step down from his duelist role and play Flex, and he was pretty damn good at it, earning the highest ACS at LCQ. Their mid-season pickup of Bang yielded the Flex role to Asuna, as he focused hard on mastering Controller, which Marv had just shown the importance of in Reykjavik. It paid off, and he was pivotal in their LCQ run. They got the reincarnation of the Clutch King Hiko in Derek, who had a slow start but exploded in LCQ with 18 clutches as well as the highest rating of the tournament. They finally solved their opping problem by bringing in Will, who wasn't the best opper but filled his role in the team perfectly. He would take up so much space on their side hits that the opponents just could not gain any ground on the retakes. And Stellar, their calm, cool, and collected leader, held the boys together as they made their insane LCQ run to champions. In Istanbul, they ran into 2 LAN veterans in Fnatic and DRX. They pulled off one upset over Fnatic, but couldn't pull any more. COVID had a pretty big impact on them, but Will, the only one to avoid the virus, had one of the best performances of the event. The player that everyone saw as their weakest might just be a bit of a Lanimal. Unfortunately, Will would not be able to prove that potential any further. With franchising causing Exet to fall apart, a legendary opper, Cryocells, who 100 Thieves had foolishly not signed last year, somehow fell back into their arms once again. Luckily, they didn't make the same mistake twice. But there was another key piece of this team that would be leaving. Sean Gares has been around both Counter-Strike and Valorant scenes for eons. He's been a player, streamer, coach, caster, broadcast analyst, but there's a certain role he prefers more than any other: father. Having to live in Texas for most of the split was tough for his family, so he resigned his position and returned home to spend more time with them. Great for him, but heartbreaking for the team, who seemed to rely heavily on him. But maybe not. According to the players and even Sean's statements, Mike's was just as big a part of their success as Sean. Sean had given Mike's the keys to the ship, with full trust in his ability to steer it well.
Keep going, you're good, you're good, and stop. Don't worry, Captain, we'll buff out those scratches.
This season wasn't fully Mike's fault. With a weekly format, assistants and analysts are incredibly important to a team's success. Mike's didn't have any of that. They had James for a time, but he apparently wasn't a good fit. According to Stellar, they tried to bring in someone else, but it didn't work out. Mike's was in a very tough position, having to 1v3 nearly every single matchup. They also had their best map, Icebox, removed from the map pool halfway through the split. They figured they'd be good on its replacement, Bind, but NRG disagreed. Even with all the struggles, they still had a win and in-game to close out the season, and it was against MIBR, who hadn't won a map in their last 5 series. They win this game, and suddenly their losses to Loud, Cloud9, and NRG, the top 3 teams in the league, don't look too bad. An early season upset to Sentinels would be their only hiccup. Just one more series and they can salvage one of the toughest seasons into a potential playoff run.
Chosen, he's blocked them off. It's a scramble. Everything on the line for it. Chosen, you gotta stick it. Chosen spraying tonight. No way. Off of it all. He's the hero in this scenario, and 100 thieves have been denied. This game is the crowd shocked into stunned silence, and I think you could say the same on the other side of the stage.
Cloud9 have been around Valorant since the very beginning, but have changed a lot since those early days. They were often referred to as Tenz and Friends because of how often Tenz would hard carry the team. But when Cloud9 cut his preferred IGL, Shinobi, Tenz decided to retire to be a streamer. He sat on their bench until Sentinels were willing to cough up enough dough to get him. Cloud9 cycled through a couple more roster changes until they settled on a solid team towards the end of 2021. The core of Vanity, Leaf, and Zeppa had made a name for themselves playing for Chaos, but NA Counter-Strike was slowly falling apart, so most of the team eventually switched over to Valorant, with the core finding their home on Cloud9. They were joined by longtime C9 player Mitch and Korean import Zeta. They proved themselves by qualifying to champs at LCQ 2021, and they were the only NA team to make it into playoffs at Champions that year, so they became the de facto best team from the region. They managed to live up to that hype during the regular season, going undefeated, but they met their match when facing Optic and the Guard in playoffs. Then they decided to trade away Zeta to T1. They got Curry in return, but it ended up being a pretty big downgrade. They went from the top seed in Split 1 to missing playoffs entirely in Split 2. They were decent at LCQ that year, but decent wasn't good enough. When it came time for franchising, Cloud9 seemed like a guarantee, but rumors started swirling that G2 was getting a spot in NA and signing the whole exit roster. Then Carlos decided to be Carlos, and G2 were denied entry. Many people assumed Evil Geniuses were the backup plan, but later reports claimed that it was Cloud9 who had originally missed out, which is kinda weird, right? But they're in now, so let's see what team they can come up with. They already have an amazing core with Vanity, Leaf, and Zeppa, so they brought in MCE, who was their coach back in CS. Then they signed Zelsis, who Vanity had experience with back on version 1. He wasn't exactly a big name player, but still a very good signing. But their next player was as big of a signing as you could get. Ye, the undisputed best player of 2022. Sounds like a recipe for a super team, right? They were a bit shaky at Red Bull home grounds, but still made it to the grand finals. They beat Paper X at lock-in, then lost to DRX. Once again, not the best, but still very reasonable. It was the best time for them to cut that legendary player they signed, as well as their IGL, right before the season started. Wait, did I say best time? Well, we'll get to that. But first, let's meet their replacements. Their new IGL is Rooney, who couldn't even make it into the Challengers League. And their new controller is Jakey, who they pulled out of Collegiate Valorant. We don't know the reasons behind these decisions. We can't even make any good guesses. The reasoning for these moves may forever be a mystery for us. But, luckily for Jack, he hired one of the most magical of all Valorant coaches. MCE brought the Guard from total obscurity all the way to Masters in just one split. He basically pulled Trent off the street to become one of the best initiators in North America. He just has this supernatural ability to find these hidden gems out of nowhere. And sure enough, Jake and Rooney were his next two diamonds. Rooney ended up as the second highest rated IGL of the season, and Jakey was the third highest rated controller main. But it was Leaf who truly carried this team, trailing only Aspas in rating. But unlike Aspas, who only played Jet, Leaf added in some Sky, Killjoy, and Neon throughout the season. Zeppa and Zelsis weren't too far behind, placing all 5 Cloud9 players in the top 20. It was a truly magical season, and this team has so much to look forward to. Just not in Tokyo. Cloud9 have now been one win away from qualifying to LAN 6 separate times, but have only won one of those games, back at 2021 LCQ. And that's pretty much all you need to know about these teams heading into LCQ this year. I know I said that Sentinels has a solid chance to make it through, but that was before I saw the bracket. As a 100 Thieves fan, I simply cannot pick against them in any match ever, so Sentinels is going out immediately. For MIBR versus KRÜ, I really should pick MIBR here because of what they did back in Week 8, but I just believe in KRÜ more right now. Not more than Furia, though. They definitely seem like the best South American team going into this event, and I don't really understand why they didn't get into the upper semis over Leviatán. Cloud9 versus 100 Thieves, once again I must pick the Thieves. Leviatán versus Furia. I'm actually going to go with Leviatán here. Yes, I did just say that Furia is the strongest South American team, but I think the break between the season and LCQ will be very useful for Leviatán and 100 Thieves to fix some of their internal issues and approach LCQ from a much stronger position. Upper final obviously goes to the Thieves. In lowers, I have to go with Cloud9 all the way. They just looked way too strong throughout the season, with their only losses being against the 3 teams already in champs. You might ask why I picked 100 Thieves to make it to champions then. But don't worry. I promise I'm not just being an overly biased fan right now. There are tons of reasons to believe in 100 Thieves right now. For example,